Good day, folks. Welcome to today's podcast, Understanding China Part 5, Making a New China. So, at the end of Part 2, I came to the Communist Party's victory in the Chinese Civil War. I did foray into a special podcast on foreign policy from 1949 because, well, it's a big subject and deserves its own podcast. However, we're going to look at what does making a new China involve. So, on October the 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood on the gate of heavenly peace and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, and famously proclaimed that the Chinese people have stood up. Now, he also stated, I'm not sure in the same speech, but around the same time, that China was open for business. And that included open for business with the US and all powers who would respect China and treat China as an equal partner. However, that, as reasons stated in the previous podcast, that didn't really get going because of the Korean War. And a good example is of the lack of respect is US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles' famous refusal to shake hands with Zhou Enlai at the 1954 Geneva Conference. Around the same time, Mao Zedong also said that China would lean to one side, meaning the Soviet Union. Now, again, Soviet Union was probably the best choice out of, well, not very good choices when it came to treating China as an equal partner. But for reasons explained in the previous podcast, the Soviets were still among those guys who didn't take China seriously, resulting in the Sino-Soviet split. Well, whether China's a communist power or not, China has to have its own path of development, and the Soviets not particularly respecting this path was part of the reasons for the falling out. Now, what did this path involve? Well, China, at least in 1949, was not going to tilt too far left. It was agreed that for China to develop successfully, it needed a broad coalition of all aspects of society, all classes, all ethnic groups, under a united front, which is what the Chinese flag represents. The five-star flag, the largest flag, is the leadership of the Communist Party, and the smaller stars representing the industrial proletariat, the peasantry, the larger bourgeoisie or the patriotic capitalists, and the petty bourgeoisie or the smaller business owners like shopkeepers. So this represents all classes of society. And again, there wasn't going to be like massive class warfare. It's just more a case of like we need to develop. We can't really have true socialism. We need to start developing. So one of the first orders of the day was the land reform. This is something which had been promised before the revolution and was and formed the backbone of the party program, because after all, the Red Army was, or later the PLA, was based upon the peasantry. So they had to really get what they signed up for, which was a more equal distribution of land, and that was the first order of business. Now after this. First of all, I'll talk a bit about the establishment of the government. So, the government is largely based upon the Soviet model. You have a central committee and you have a Politburo, a wider Politburo, and a smaller, closely knit Politburo standing committee. Now, the numbers of this committee has varied from, I believe it was 5 at its lowest point, to the standard number, the current number, which is 7, to as large as 9, it was 9 during the Hu Jintao decade. The Politburo Standing Committee normally includes the chairman, the premier, and the state chairman or president. The ones at this time were obviously Mao Zedong, chairman of the party and also chairman of the military commission, Premier Zhou Enlai, and state chairman Liu Shaoqi. Now, Liu Shaoqi came from. He was maybe the member of the Politburo who had the most experience in the labour world. He'd been a trade union organiser. He'd been an industrial agitator. He'd led strikes. He'd also been educated at Moscow at the toils of the East University, and by 1961 he was announced as Mao Zedong's intended successor, and had become a very prominent figure within the party. Other prominent figures in the 1950s also include Chen Yun, um, Marshal Peng Dehuai, who I believe at one point was the chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, and also Deng Xiaoping, who was at the time General Secretary of the party. Now, the position of General Secretary at this time was very different to the position of General Secretary now, which has replaced the position of Chairman. Now, enough about personalities. Let's focus on policy. So, one of the defining parts of the Mao Zedong era, and one of the more unfortunate parts, is the Great Leap Forward. Now, the Great Leap Forward was designed to boost China's industrial capacity, and the slogan was catch up, overtake Britain, and catch up with the USA. And this was to happen in 5 years. And quotas, retrospectively impossible quotas, were set for steel production and also grain production. Now, most people familiar with China will know that the Great Leap Forward was a disaster, and this podcast does not disagree with that assessment. What I would like to say is that the Great Leap Forward was more a systemic failure. It was a systemic failure because the quotas which were set were impossible. However, you had many party cadres who would push rather too hard for these quotas to be met, which would result in many people. Well, it's famously associated with the use of backyard furnaces. What Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev once famously called samovars, and people were told to take their metal possessions and melt them down. Now, the problem with this is the metal that was produced from this was brittle and useless. The other problem is that the quotas for grain production were almost impossible. Now, you also had a floods at the time, and floods perpetuated the famine. But the trouble was, this wasn't getting reported back up. People were saying, "Oh no, we'll meet the quotas. Everything's going swimmingly," and it wasn't. So I would just like to say in defence that many people will try to say that Mao Zedong was the greatest mass killer of the 20th century. Well, no, this was a systemic failure. This wasn't a campaign to eradicate a certain group of people. It wasn't a purge. It was a systemic failure, and actually there were similar floods and similar famines of equal scale in India at the time. So this was very much a hiccup and a systemic failure. And the government recognised this. Mao Zedong once made a speech where, if the figures were higher than, and I knew about this, I should lose my head. Now, around this time, figures such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping became more prominent, and they realised that, hang on a minute, we can't continue with the same mode as the Great Leap Forward. We have to take a different approach. Now this carried on for a few years until 1966, which is normally the date. Well, no, not normally. It is the date when the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was launched. Now, this began as a reaction to a play, High Ray Dismissed from Office. And this was seen as an oblique criticism of the government, particularly felt by Jiang Qing, the then wife of Mao Zedong. Now, this resulted in the a campaign to eradicate what's called the Four Olds: old tradition, old culture, old habits, old lifestyle. Now, in many ways, this was in some ways you could say that this was unconscious Trotskyism, like the idea of permanent revolution. That if a government becomes too entrenched, it becomes ossified, and you need a new revolution to shake things up. Now, I'm not saying that this was Trotskyist, because Trotskyism was not followed in China. I mean, Chen Zhou, one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, after he left the party, he briefly led China's short-lived Trotskyist movement, but there's no evidence that this was in any way inspired by Trotskyism. So, however, it was an anti-intellectual movement. This is in line with some of Mao Zedong's famous proverbs. One of his famous proverbs was, to read too many books is harmful. He would use the example of a pig farmer. He says, you can open and close a book when you want, whereas a pig farmer has a much harder task. The book doesn't run away from you. The pig will run away from you when you try to slaughter it. So there's also the important motto, practice is the sole criterion of truth. So you have theory, you can have theory all you like, but you cannot know if it's truth without practice. So it was generally felt that segments of society had become kind of ossified, they'd become kind of an elitist bubble, which is why many people were sent down to the countryside. They felt they should learn from the workers, learn from the peasantry, and this would include party cadres and many leading people in the party. This included Bo Yibo. Deng Xiaoping was also sent down to the countryside to, I believe he was working in a tractor factory in Jiangxi province. The young Xi Jinping also was one of the sent down youth. Now, a major casualty of the Cultural Revolution was Liu Shaoqi. Now, Liu Shaoqi was denounced as the #1 capitalist roader, and he was imprisoned in Kaifeng, Henan province, where he died of complications from diabetes under harsh conditions. Now, this is subsequent party plenums, I believe a plenum in 1980, recognised the mistreatment of Liu Shaoqi as a mistake, and he was posthumously rehabilitated. Many victims of the Cultural Revolution were posthumously rehabilitated, and many of the main perpetrators of the Cultural Revolution have been subsequently denounced and or expelled from the party posthumously, including Kang Sheng, the intelligence chief, and possibly Chen Bodao. I just need to check on that. Now, this takes us to the issue of succession. Now, Mao Zedong's first touted successor was Liu Shaoqi, but we've just explained what happened to him. Now, afterwards, a very brilliant field marshal by the name of Lin Biao was then touted as Mao Zedong's successor. Now, Lin Biao was, during the Cultural Revolution period, he was always seen at Mao Zedong's side. Many paintings, many ceramics from that period, you can see Mao Zedong with Marshal Lin Biao. He was also China's defense minister. Now, the Lin Biao incident is still something of a mystery, and I always say that there's the official explanation, and then there's some other explanations, and it's all a bit difficult to add up. But often with these many things, the truth may lie somewhere in the middle. So, in 1971, Lin Biao is said to have been plotting a coup against Mao Zedong, and he takes an ill-fated flight to the Soviet Union. It was done in a hurry. The plane was not properly fueled, and it crashed in Mongolia, killing everyone on board, including Lin Biao and his wife. Now, a bit about Lin Biao. Lin Biao was from Hubei province. That's one province up from Hunan. That's the one where Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi and Peng Dehuai, many other people are from Hunan. He's the only famous person I can think of from Hubei province, apart from the tennis player Li Na. But anyway, enough about that. He was, in many ways, a brilliant military commander. He'd begun in the Kuomintang, but had changed over to the Communist Party. He was very prominent in the latter stages of the Civil War, particularly the parts in Manchuria. Now, at this point, he wasn't a hypochondriac. One of the defining features of him was that he was a terrible hypochondriac. He was afraid of drafts and wind. Also, he was afraid of water. Apparently, the only way he could be hydrated was from his wife dipping bread in his soup. So he's a bit of an obscure character. He's also a bit reclusive, and it's a bit of a strange choice for successor. Now, why did he get on his ill-fated flight? Now, the official explanation was that he was plotting a coup against Mao Zedong himself. Now, this doesn't really make sense because all he has to do is just wait the clock out another 5 years. There's another explanation that says that he was afraid that he would suffer the same fate as Liu Shaoqi, be denounced as a capitalist raider and subsequently purged. That's one explanation, but from various things I've read, the most or maybe the most credible explanation is his son. His son was a bit too much of a loudmouth and liked to talk up his potential as China's next new leader, and he was a bit afraid that, well, hang on a minute, you've run your mouth off a bit too much, you've got us into trouble. And that's why he took the flight. Another explanation says he was against restoration of ties, reconciliation with the United States. That's one explanation. I'm going to be bold enough to say that I don't know. It's one of these complicated things which is still mysterious, and it's still unresolved to this time. It's possibly one of those areas which is also a taboo subject in China. I mean, I've just talked about two pretty taboo subjects, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. However, it's impossible to do a podcast on the Mao Zedong era without mentioning those two incidents. Anything else would be disingenuous. So this takes us to 71. Now, the Cultural Revolution is still officially in place, but the worst excesses are over. The worst excesses occurred in 66 to 67. Now, at this point, with Liu Shaoqi out the, Lin Biao and his ill-fated flight, Mao Zedong announces that his successor will be Zhou Enlai. Well, Zhou Enlai is only 5 years younger than Mao Zedong, and by this point he has bladder cancer, and he dies, I believe, 9 months before Mao Zedong in 1976. I mean, 1976 was a bit of an unfortunate year. You had, first of all, death of Zhou Enlai, and then I believe Peng Dehuai, then Mao Zedong himself. And then finally the Tangshan earthquake, the worst earthquake of the 20th century. So at this point, we'll try and round off this podcast. But the main take home points from this this podcast is that the Mao Zedong years are integral for understanding China. There's many. Number one, the land reform is considered one of the great achievements. It also sets the tone for for subsequent development, because there's kind of this emphasis on not being too ideological. There's a good quote from Deng Xiaoping: China must safeguard from the right, but primarily against the left. So, without further ado, I'll wrap up today's podcast, and the next podcast will be looking at China since 1976, particularly the Reform era. So, thank you very much, all, and good day to you all.